theme that has really driven this market internationally. Forestry is in there in one small bit, which we'll talk about, but quite frankly, it's been a voluntary market exclusive commodity. So as such, what we've seen is that the marketing and focus of forestry products has really been limited to those types of companies looking at CSR type objectives. What we've seen happen now in the last couple of years, maybe even few years, depending on what part of the world you're in, is this idea of pre-compliance. So this transition from voluntary to compliant market, compliance being the obligation that certain companies will have to meet GHG emission reductions. So this idea of pre-compliance is this concept of looking at what products are out there in the forestry space, making the assumption, in some cases a good assumption, that forestry will play into some of these compliant markets, which types of forestry will play, and is there a hedge or arbitrage opportunity in investing in some of these projects now that may be compliant down the road. So this has been the distinction, and it's a distinction I'll use when I talk about voluntary versus pre-compliant or compliant. So forestry protocols are many in the voluntary space, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. And we're starting to see some momentum in this pre-compliant compliance space. And I've mentioned there AB 32, WCI, which is the Western Climate Initiative, certainly here in BC, and what's going on internationally with the CDM. We'll make another quick distinction, and that's the distinction between voluntary and compliant customers. As mentioned, voluntary customers are really motivated by CSR objectives. And those can be many. It could be just this heartfelt objective to actually be socially conscious and aware of the impact that they do have in the environment as a business, and looking at ways, first of all, to reduce their impact, and secondly, looking at ways to mitigate, possibly through using offset opportunities, which of course forestry has always been one, in large part because it is very tangible and it's very charismatic. On the other side, we have the compliant market, and they're motivated, obviously, by legislated obligations. So really a commodity is a commodity is a commodity. The story doesn't matter so much in the compliant field. It's nice to have a story. It's not necessary. Quite frankly, what they're looking for is the lowest cost of compliance. So where does that leave us in these markets? And I apologize in advance if there's a lot here, but there's a lot of short-form things in this carbon space, and I'll try and explain them as best as I can. The voluntary market is filled with a number of different protocols. And when I refer to the voluntary market, it's just one big international voluntary market. So what we see in the developing compliant markets are much more specific. And in looking at those markets, there's specific types of offsets that play within those markets. But voluntary internationally, it's whatever really the customer wants to buy. So you differentiate yourself by potentially using a different type of protocol or methodology to validate and verify that project. So if we look at the voluntary markets right now, what are the big ones? What are the big protocols that are out there? You see CAR in the top corner there. CAR is a climate action reserve, and that all ties into California. California, under AB 32, which is their emissions trading policy, is looking heavily at forestry. So what they're doing is taking CAR protocols and adopting those in their initial kick at the can as far as offsets within that program. CAR has been a very popular protocol within the United States. It's a homegrown protocol developed in California, so naturally we're going to see that morph into something within AB 32 within California. VCS, that's the Verified Carbon Standard. It's frequently known as the Voluntary Carbon Standard. They've recently gone through a little bit of updated rebranding. So when I say VCS, it is the Voluntary Carbon Standard, but the new name is Verified Carbon Standard. The Verified Carbon Standard is perhaps the most well-known international voluntary protocol. When I say voluntary, it is still voluntary because we don't see it as being compliant yet. It may be grandfathered into some of these compliant regimes. We don't know, but those discussions are ongoing. But it is internationally recognized, and they have a number of protocols across a number of subsections. Specifically, they have a number of, in forestry, which we'll talk about. CCBA, that stands for Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance. CCBA is a very important forestry standard insofar as it doesn't necessarily consider carbon in so much as it considers all of those other things that are in that name, the community co-benefits, the social co-benefits, environmental co-benefits that come with actually developing a project. So quite often what you see in that space is somebody doing a project and using perhaps VCS or CAR to actually do the technical validation and using CCBA, layering it on top as a subsequent validation and verification in order to produce kind of like the home run of forestry carbon credits. So it has both the technical fortitude and it also has the social and environmental co-benefit fortitude. PFSI VERs, this is a New Zealand thing, Permanent Forest Sink Initiative VERs. These are created on restoration projects that are monetized in an ex-post fashion, and we'll talk about that a little bit. ISO 14064-2-3. Canada, interestingly, even federally, has actually stated that any carbon project that's developed has to conform to ISO standards. ISO standards, as many of you may know, is it's basically a framework of a process that you go through. It's not insofar as VCS or CAR or any of these other protocols technical in the way you actually determine your carbon sequestration rates and whatnot. So generally what you're doing is using an ISO platform and importing different sections and subsections of protocols like VCS or CAR to actually do the technical accounting. Carbon fix, German standard, often used in international restoration projects. It's another way of course, monetizing restoration projects in the voluntary space. Social carbon, same thing. Plan Vivo, same thing. And of course, CDM. CDM is Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, often used, of course, for obligations under the European Trading Scheme. And it is used in some cases for voluntary purchases. Forestry being one of those, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a sec. So moving from these voluntary markets into the compliant markets, or what we call pre-compliant markets, what's out there right now? And this is important if you're looking at developing a project or contemplating getting involved in the carbon space within forestry. Right now, CAR has two different protocols, which we'll talk about, that are on the docket under AB 32, and that's why you see those things listed there in the pre-compliant markets, AB 32, BC potentially, the emissions trading scheme here, which also includes the Western Climate Initiative, which is Quebec, Ontario, BC, potentially Manitoba, and a handful of other states, including California. So the protocols that are being looked at right now, CAR, definitely, there's two different protocols, Urban Forestry Protocol, and their General Forestry 3.2 version, I think it is, which looks at improved forest management, avoided conversion, and restoration. But you also have to look at VCS. And why VCS? Well, VCS right now is the only protocol or has the only protocols for RED, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And those are programs that are international. They look at avoided conversion projects in tropical and developing countries. And they also have some really, really good forestry protocols for improved forest management, which we'll talk about shortly. Will they be compliant under California or the WCI? We don't know yet. But we do know in California that they are looking at RED, and they're looking at RED from Brazil and Mexico perhaps in 2015 and beyond, but again, there's a question mark there. FCOP, this is interesting, and for those of you not in BC, you may not know about this, but FCOP is the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol. That's being developed by the BC government in conjunction with the Climate Action Secretariat, which is a government arm here, working on the emissions trading scheme. The Pacific Carbon Trust, which is an organization that's been empowered by the government here to kickstart the low-carbon economy and actually accrue about 1 million tons a year to offset public sector enterprise here in BC, basically offsetting the government's footprint. And the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol is to look at same things, improved forest management, avoided conversion, restoration projects, but from a BC perspective. And quite frankly, I think what you'll see happen here is perhaps Ontario and Quebec might look at this and adopt it and adapt it for Ontario and BC. And hopefully it'll be fungible into the Western Climate Initiative. So for us as a company, we look at CAR, we look at VCS, we look at FCOP, because these are certainly voluntary now, but they have pre-compliance connotations. And